Hello again, 122. In this part 1 video, I will go over the first and fourth questions of Chapter 21, European Imperialism in Africa and Asia in the 19th Century. This is a very complicated chapter. You really need to read this from beginning to end. It's pretty long, and I've split this up into a few parts as a result. Pretty much we'll go over why they're in a rush to establish colonies and protectorates in Africa and Asia. And we'll also explain the different types of rule that the English and the French used. So we need to revere these conquering heroes after all, because they are going to need to expand. A new phase of expansion begins in the 1800s. Whereas before, the aims in the East could be summed up as Christians and spices, and Western gold and silver were exchanged for those different items. Now European nations begin to view Asian and African societies as markets for the prodigious output of European factories and sources of raw materials needed to fuel the Western industrial machine. This relationship between the West and African and Asian societies has been called the new imperialism, and this was caused because of the industrial revolutions. The relationship between colonialism and national survival was expressed directly by the French politician Jules Ferry in 1885. A policy of containment or abstinence, he warned, would set France on the broad road to decadence and initiate its decline into a third or fourth-rate power. British imperialists, convinced by the theory of social Darwinism, that in the struggle between nations only the fit are victorious and survived, agreed. So because of the Industrial Revolution, the home markets have become saturated. They're not growing anymore. So now they got to find new markets for all of these heavily machine-produced goods that are no longer being consumed at home. And also, as we've talked about before, these different protectorates and colonies can be sources of raw materials as well, as we'll see. For some, colonialism had a moral purpose, whether to promote Christianity or to build a better world. This is another reason for the need to establish these protectorates and colonies. The civilizing mission, such as the white man's burden. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' needs, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hopes to naught. And this is response then from Edmund Morrell, the black man's burden. It is the Africans who carry the black man's burden. They have not withered away before the white man's occupation. Indeed, Africa has ultimately absorbed within itself every Caucasian and, for that matter, every Semitic invader, such as the Arabs or the Jews, the Semitic tribes of the Middle East. In hewing out for himself a fixed abode in Africa, the white man has massacred the African in heaps. The African has survived, and it is well for the white settlers that he has. What the partial occupation of his soil by the white man has failed to do, what the mapping out of European political spheres of influence has failed to do, what the Maxim, the machine gun, and the rifle, the slave gang, labor in the bowels of the earth and mines, and the lash have failed to do, what imported measles, smallpox, and syphilis have failed to do, whatever the overseas slave trade failed to do, the power of modern capitalistic exploitation, assisted by modern engines of destruction like the Maxim, may yet succeed in accomplishing. For from the evils of the latter, scientifically applied and enforced, there is no escape for the African. Its destructive effects are not spasmodic, they are permanent. And its permanence resides in its fatal consequences. It kills not the body merely, but the soul. It breaks the spirit. It attacks the African at every turn, from every point of vantage. It wrecks his polity, uproots him from the land, invades his family life, destroys his natural pursuits and occupations, claims his whole time, enslaves him in his own home. So you can see that reaction. So what are the tactics now that the Europeans are going to use in establishing these protectorates or colonies or territories in Africa and Asia? In some cases, the goal could be realized in cooperation with local political elites, whose loyalty could be earned or purchased by economic rewards or by confirming them in their positions of authority and status in a new colonial setting. Sometimes, however, this policy of indirect rule, one style, usually preferred by the British, was not feasible because local leaders refused to cooperate with their colonial masters or even actively resisted, and there was much resistance from African leadership and African residents. In such cases, the imperialists resorted to direct rule, removing local elites from power and replacing them with officials from the mother country. The French preferred direct rule and then attempting to assimilate the local population into little French men and women. As the competition for colonies increased, the colonial powers sought to solidify their hold over their territories to protect them from attack by their rivals. Sometimes they'd take over areas adjacent to a colony, as the British will do in Egypt, because there is something important nearby, that, like the Suez Canal, that they do not want to see touched. The Suez is the gateway to the crown jewel of the British Empire, India. And after 1880, the quest for colonies becomes a scramble, as all the major European states, now joined by the United States and Japan, engaged in a global land grab. The philosophy is basically social Darwinism. Might makes right. Again, this is a pseudo-scientific theory based on Charles Darwin's biological studies, and now it was applied to the relations between nation states, which is not really a valid argument. Unless you adapt to changing circumstances, it was thought in the 19th century, this is the only way that you can survive and prosper in a world that's governed by this idea of survival of the fittest. So if you conquer, you're validated. You are superior. You are the strongest. You are the fittest. But not everybody's happy with this brutal view, and they saw a moral justification. So we can justify this, that we're bringing them the benefits of Western democracy, capitalism, and Christianity. We're going, as Kipling said in the poem, we're going to civilize and Christianize them. And then we will enable primitive peoples to adapt to the challenges of the modern world. And buttressed by such comforting theories, sensitive Westerners could ignore the brutal aspects of colonialism and persuade themselves that in the long run, the results would be beneficial for both sides. And that ends almost this first part. Just one more thing. By 1900, almost all of the societies of Africa and Asia were either under full colonial rule or, as in China and the Ottoman Empire, at a point of virtual collapse. Only a handful of states there mentioned managed to escape the internal disintegration or subjection to colonial rule. And that ends the first part of chapter 21.